Hello and welcome to another fully live Q&A episode of Hacking with Friends. My name is Kody Kinzie. I am a security researcher at Varonis, and today we have a surprise guest, Joe, the head of our forensics and incident response team. Joe, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, great to be here, Kody. Really excited to talk about, some of the stuff we're seeing in the field. If I'm going to introduce myself, take 10 seconds really quick. I lead our forensics operations teams here at Varonis, which really boils down to meaning we help customers who are having security incidents. So if a customer has an incident, they're in peril, we're there to help them. We're there to help them do incident response, as well as running adversary simulations for our customers when they want that type of experience too. And yeah,
That
super
type of
excited to talk about this.
experience
Yeah.
sounds pretty exciting, honestly.
I mean, it normally is. Yeah. I mean, it's a really engaging thing to be able to go to a customer, a target environment, bring our custom tools along, bring our, command and control platforms along, stand up that infrastructure for each engagement and really show customers the adversary side of things. Because for most organizations, for most people, that's not something that they get to experience. It's not something they get to see firsthand. We hear about it in the news, right? We hear about all the recent hacks and everything going on, but normally people see the defense side of things more than the offense side of things.
Yeah. So we've had Killian from Varonis on to talk about a number of different things, but we, from that, started thinking about who else at Varonis would have some really interesting stories. And we kind of tossed it around for a while. And eventually it was decided, like, obviously the people who are dealing with the most interesting things, adversary simulation, and then also incident response and forensics, are going to have some of the wildest stories. So for the longest time, we felt like we actually couldn't do this segment because the stories were so juicy and a lot of the time companies are sensitive about that sort of thing. But because Varonis deals with so many of these, like over time, the tactics and the things that happen start to kind of overlap, and you start to see patterns that only people in that position get to see. So it's really cool to be able to talk about not only like some of the craziest attacks that have happened, but also just patterns that are really prevalent and things that actually work, like things that hackers are actually focusing on as effective ways of doing this stuff. And what I was kind of surprised in our little chat beforehand to learn is that most of this isn't like fancy, like 0-day stuff. It's just finding old stuff on servers or permissions that are set wrong or some way in, and then abusing things that have been known forever. And it's often, kind of difficult to tell who's doing it because the tools that are being used are things that everybody has heard of. Like a lot of like maybe gatekeeper hackers would be like, oh, like, like some of these tools are for noobs. But in fact, if they're effective, then getting somebody to jump on TeamViewer, or whatever, like it might be the thing that gets you into an organization that's what the biggest, weakest link was. So it was really cool to hear some of the things we're hinting at in our conversation beforehand. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about adversary simulation, because that sounds incredibly cool. And I didn't even think of that. So we came up with this incident of the month idea thinking, hey, like we'll get some great stories from people who are in a high level position to see all this crazy stuff going on and what works, what doesn't work, and how people kind of get caught. But the adversary simulation stuff also just sounds like an incredibly cool job. And I wonder if you might like explain a little bit more about that for our like kind of beginner viewers who might be looking for like a cool job in cybersecurity and might never have heard of this, or like, is this maybe just like a way for them to think of like pen testing in a very specific engagement or environment, or like maybe how should beginners see that sort of job?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, just real quick to address, one of the first things we were mentioning, threat actors do keep it simple, and we can talk about this more, but really, the more complex, the more, let's say, elegant or unique you try to be with an attack you're doing, then there's more opportunities for failure. There's more opportunities for something to go wrong. So, as often as possible, what we see in the field, we handle real engagements with customers every day, every week, ransomware events every week, et cetera. And we see simple tactics and techniques being used by threat actors. They're not doing crazy stuff. They're doing very basic attacks, and their TTPs are very common, and something we'll get into more. As far as the adversary simulation sides, if we take a minute to talk about this, really, what we provide to customers is the ability to simulate an offensive scenario in their environment, or to simulate a threat actor in their environment. And what we, kind of how we differentiate this from, what you might think of as a purple team engagement or a penetration test, is we're not going full bore for a week. We're not necessarily collaborating directly with their blue team. penetration test is kind of a more involved thing. They're running, you know, a standard set of tools often, depending on the company doing this, or they are kind of targeting, you know, specific applications in the environment or specific services, and like exploiting vulnerabilities and this sort of thing. And really what we do is we have, you know, a set of custom tools we've developed that simulate threat actor behavior based on what we see in our real engagement. So we take our knowledge from the
Hmm.
incident response work we're doing, we bring that back to our adversary simulation, what we call a cyber resiliency assessment. And we, you know, use these tools and use our command and control framework and other things to kind of test the customer's defenses in depth, to test them at the Active Directory level, at the network level, network detection, at, you know, the DNS level. You know, are you monitoring your DNS? Are you going to detect when we, you know, simulate C2 activity over DNS? This is the type of things we're talking about. So it's a little different, kind of a more overview of a broad picture of adversary behavior.
So the way I'm kind of interpreting that is like you're in a position to see like real adversaries' dirtiest tricks or like the most effective dirty tricks, and then turn around and create custom ways of emulating that. So like customers are aware of it, and then they basically get the experience of what it would be like if these things that are kind of trending in maybe the cybercrime market, or maybe just like with advanced threat actors in general, if that were to happen to them, like what would happen? What would it look like? Is that kind of more similar to
Yeah,
what you do
no,
as
I
opposed
think
to
that's
running a standard
accurate.
set of tools?
That's roughly accurate. You know, we don't have a, and that's the other difference between what we do in a penetration test or a purple team. We don't have a standard set of things where we say on every engagement we must do X, Y, Z. We keep it fluid, just like an adversary would. An adversary is not going to bring the same bag of tricks to every single customer they target, or sorry, every single network they target. Rather, they're going to do something, you know, different depending on what's available in that network, what services are exposed, what type of device and user account they landed on when they first compromised. And I say landed on as in if someone clicks a phishing link, you know, they don't know who they're going to have access to. They don't know what device they're going to end up on unless it's a very targeted type of attack, you know, something else other than, you know, most threat actors are just kind of sending out phishing links, or they're compromising something that's public facing. So, you know, they do reconnaissance, they figure out where they are, they figure out what permissions they have. And that's the type of stuff we do also. You know, we
Hmm.
figure out what host are we on? What's installed on it? Is there something with a vulnerable CVE, for example, and some installed software that we could take advantage of to escalate permissions? And so this is the type of, you know, it's a fluid engagement, and it's interactive. You know, we want customers to learn from this. We don't want to just do a bunch of stuff and not talk about it. So we talk about what we're doing, we explain it to them, we explain the significance and the consequences, and that's something else that kind of sets it apart from a standard pen test. It's very, very dynamic, very interactive.
That's cool. Sounds like you have a lot more freedom to run real world tests versus what's kind of expected in like a checked box kind of scenario. So that's really interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Huh. So I have something to enter into the ring of improvised hacking tools. So the most popular video we had on our channel last week was a video on this LoRa experience that I created here. This is a open source little microcontroller breakout plugged into a breadboard, which has LoRa module, and it's designed to act as an HID device. So it's going to set itself up as a keyboard. And when it receives a signal, it is supposed to execute a Rickroll. Now, doing this immediately before the stream, it was working. Now it is currently running and currently not doing a Rickroll, but at any moment it could. So if you just hear that happen, then that means that Python's working. But in just a little bit of code here, which I was working on earlier, I was able to get this example to the point that it was executing commands remotely as soon as it received a signal via LoRa. And the best range I got on this was about 3 or 4 miles. So in a month or two, if I wanted to, I could miniaturize this down to about the size of a postage stamp and make it so that if it was plugged into a computer, I could even like make a PCB that has like, you know, USB type A traces. So I could just plug it in and it's kind of just sits in the back there. I could trigger it from like 4 or 5 miles away and get it to run a command and do something interesting. So I really like LoRa. I think it's like a cool and interesting protocol to work with. And I've just been trying out what's like the longest range interesting thing I can get to happen. And I've gone from just getting signals to working, which was last week's video, to actually being able to do a bad USB attack or like a HID attack where I'm injecting commands into a computer from really far away based on just this long range signal. So we were chatting a little bit before about drones and how, for me anyway, this has been like something where I've had to make drone payloads to like lift this thing up to get line of sight in order to do some of these testings. But there's a lot of interesting cybersecurity related things you can do with drones. And yeah, very, very cool. And I'm looking forward to maybe demonstrating this a little bit more when it actually works.
Awesome. Very cool.
So we had a question from James, and that was, my problem doing forensics is I would always have a small doubt. I found every backdoor inserted, and I fully secured everything. How do you know that the job is done?
Yeah, great question. I mean, and that is definitely a very real concern to have when you're talking about examining a device that has been, potentially compromised or known compromised by a threat actor. Our recommendation is always going to be, if you believe that a threat actor touched the device, or if we, believe that to a reasonable degree of confidence, then you should either wipe the device and start fresh from a golden image, or you should restore a backup to a point prior to when the threat activity occurred. That's really the only way to be 100% certain in these situations. Most organizations don't have the required level of telemetry or audit data to be able to say otherwise in the vast majority of cases. And I'll just add this, I work on some open source tools on my GitHub. One of those tools is something to help incident responders detect persistence mechanisms. And there are, hundreds, if not thousands of ways to have something persist on disk. So being able to accurately find and triage all of these, it's not realistic. And so the answer is really, if we think someone touched it, our recommendation is always going to be wipe it clean and start over. So that's really it.
I remember I was reporting on like a data center in Brazil. I think it was for like AWS or for some like really important client that was compromised, and they just sent everything back to the manufacturer. They're just like, we're like, sorry,
Yeah.
like we're just going to get new servers. Like we just don't trust it, which was crazy to me. I've never heard of that before, but that's real. Yeah, that's one of those things where if it's bad enough, or if you're really concerned enough because of the device is that important, then maybe you go so far as to return the actual servers if it's something you just cannot take any risks on. But restoring from the point before activity, I mean, if you have a reasonable backup policy, that seems like the best compromise between complete scorched earth, like trying to get the manufacturer to take it back, and like you're just restoring immediately.
So, and the Fortune 500 I used to work for before Varonis, the backup, every server in the environment, which we're talking about 20, 30,000 servers, was backed up with differentials on a daily basis too. So for some organizations, this is very easy to do. For some, it's not so easy, and it depends. Maybe the backups were also compromised by a threat actor. But to your point, when we're talking about hardware and firmware, there are advanced threats out there. There are government entities out there who will, insert themselves into supply chains, alter firmware, implant backdoors, or hardware level implants. This is not imaginary. Yeah, this stuff happens. We don't see that type of thing too often, in the threats that we deal with, but it does happen surely. And better safe than sorry. Absolutely.
So here's a question: do you think that CTFs are good for hacking mastery?
It depends. So, I've done a lot of hack the box. I've done a lot of try hack me type of stuff. They are really fun. They are really engaging. You can learn a lot about cybersecurity doing those types of engagements, doing those types of courses, and that type of activity. I think we're never done learning in the cybersecurity field, at least. We're learning every day, every engagement we go on. Sometimes we're learning something new about a particular product or application or technique. So, as long as you're learning something, it's good. But really, it depends on, what you're trying to get into. So if you're trying to get into the red team side of things, red team is very broad. There's a lot of different roles, a lot of specialties, and a lot of companies looking to hire people who have red team experience. So it can never hurt.
Yeah. I would say from my experience, if you are getting into something that you haven't done before with a CTF, and it's not something that's highly proprietary, it's something you would actually see in the real world, then it's a valuable thing to partake in. I wouldn't just get too discouraged if you don't perform well at CTFs. I found that a lot of the CTFs I joined early on were way out of my league. And like, it was a little discouraging at first. So finding ones that are well suited to the skills you're interested in investing in is one thing that's really helpful. And then just making sure that it does align with like real world stuff. Some of the like ciphers that I tried to work on were just insane when I first got started. And I really had to level up in order to even understand what was going on. But at first, it almost made me quit. So don't be too hard on yourself when you're just getting started, but do learn the kinds of tools that will be useful in virtually every CTF, like network scanning tools, being able to find your way around a network. Those are like some of the just IT skills that I feel like a lot of people, especially computer science people, slept on and like ended up kind of like struggling in some of these CTFs when they can't find their way around a network or do some of these more like IT oriented tasks. So like bash scripting, using Linux tools, networking, these are all things that are going to do well for you at pretty much any CTF that you attend. So I would say for buffing those skills, CTFs are wonderful and get you introduced to the tools that you're going to use in the real world. So I would say, yeah.
Something that you mentioned too, it is IT background, super important. A lot of cybersecurity people don't go straight into cybersecurity. They start in IT. It's funny, when I did my master's in cyber, one of the things they made us do in our crypto class was we were doing rounds of the AES cipher by hand on paper. So yeah, that really helps you learn it, but not very practical, not something you really need to know in reality. Yeah.
Yeah, I did a computer science path after I was like, all right, I need to learn programming. Like I need to be able to work with computers. So I thought like computer science, like that makes sense. So I went into that and the teacher that I had was like, oh, we're so much better than IT. And, that basically they're the janitors of computers. And I was like, it's so rude and derogatory. And I went to an IT class and it was so much more challenging, but I got so much more out of it. In failing one routing and switching class, I learned more about the way that the internet works and how to find my way around a network than I did in 3 years of computer science. So I think that it's one of those things that's often not emphasized enough, but for security professionals or for anybody that wants to work with computers in general, IT skills is just like a self-help kind of thing. Like you just need it to be able to get around. I equate it to having a flashlight, like to see around the network. If you don't have that, it's all just invisible theoretical stuff.
I mean, to that point, we're an expert forensics response team, adversary simulation team. And when I start my interviews, I ask about Active Directory. I ask about networking. I ask about common IT concepts that I expect people to have a foundation in to be able to, support the rest of their knowledge. Because if you don't have that foundation, everything will just fall apart. You'll come to a situation that involves some level of networking or Azure or AWS or something that you're just not familiar with, or you don't have the background to understand, and it becomes a problem.
Comment, I don't perform very well in most CTFs. I have like a YouTube channel on cybersecurity, which has like multiple millions of views, and I have lost every CTF that I've partaken in that I did not also create. I have created a couple CTFs and I do very well at those. Thank you very much. But yeah, so don't worry about that. Like you just participating in it and being aware of the tools used. Like I personally don't have a lot of time to invest in that sort of thing because my focus is elsewhere within cybersecurity. But you just have to realize there's room for all kinds of weirdos in this field. It just depends on what kinds of weirdo skills you like to really get interested in and double down on. So for beginners, I would say do not take yourself too seriously in CTFs until you start winning. Then take yourself a little bit more seriously. Otherwise, it's just a fun way to get together with people who probably have more skill than you and learn from them. That's the point. It's not to compete with them and feel bad about yourself. It's to be around people who are like smarter than you and better. Well, not smarter than you, but more experienced at this, or maybe also smarter than you. It's kind of nice, honestly. And then learn from them and like become a little bit smarter at this too by just seeing what people who are having a good time are doing to win. It's cool. So if you're participating in CTFs, especially if there are conferences and that sort of thing, and you actually get to learn from the other people in the CTF, then I really encourage you to keep doing that. But if you're not able to, then it's a way to stay connected to the cybersecurity community and continually learn new skills. So, I really don't have many negative things to say other than that some of the highly specific ones can be quite discouraging. So, yeah.
Done a lot of out-of-the-box challenges. I could probably count on one hand the number I've done without having to look up a guide. So they're not easy. Not easy.
No. And for me, I only recently got into web application pen testing, and I'm like a total beginner at it now, but I think it's so much fun and so easy that I'm trying to get other people interested in it too. So some of these things you just break into late because they seem a lot harder than they actually are. And then I don't know what day we learned HTTP status codes in like high school, but like I must have been sick because like
Yeah.
it was not included in computer science. It was not really included in networking either, but learning all that stuff was like just opening a door for doing some of the stuff that I thought was so hard and ended up being not that hard at all. So yeah, like there's a lot of things that with a couple weeks of effort, you could be reasonably decent at. And I think that's the allure of cybersecurity is there is some of this low hanging fruit that's a part of some of these bigger careers. And web app pen testing was one of mine. So that's why I would say CTF's amazing for learning web app pen testing. Let's see. All right. A Nullbyte fan. I want to thank you, Nullbyte. I'm Null. You are the bytes, to be clear. But thank you for your effort. I really like you and follow all your videos. I am new to this field. What do you advise me to start with? I am 16 years old. Well, so there's a lot of beginners who watch our channel because it gives all of you an idea of what are the things you can get started on now. It's nice to be able to start on a project and get an immediate result. But the truth is, a lot of these fields require some work that's like a lot less exciting. And what's cool about cybersecurity is you can poke around and you can find the things that really resonate with you that you'll stay up all night like working on that you think are like the coolest part. And you can kind of hyper focus on that and get good at it and build a career around those skills that adds on other things, but builds on your passions and your natural talents. And I think that that is one of the things that my videos have been good at doing is connecting people with the parts of cybersecurity or ethical hacking that they think is so cool that they're willing to go to a conference and talk in front of a bunch of other nerds because like they can't stop talking about it. And their friends are just like, will you please shut up? You know? So connecting people to those communities, I think is probably the most important thing. Whether it's online or going in person, if you can go from like an interest to actually showing up and like meeting other people who are like you and seeing them have stable careers and asking what it's like to work where they work, like that's kind of what I would hope for you. So yeah, just connect with communities, learn the things that are really, really interesting to you and prepare yourself for learning the boring parts by learning the parts that light your mind on fire first, I guess would be my advice. All right, so I don't want to spend it is a Q&A stream. So let's see if there's any other good ones. Okay, I'll send this one your way. Have you heard about the Apex Legends hack?
Yeah. So bit of a gamer myself and definitely was paying attention when, we see what's going on here. And, without having too much background on it, as I haven't read up on it specifically, but, it seemed like that there was some possible remote code vulnerability, some type of injection vulnerability that may have existed in the client. It's not exactly clear to me how that worked. Whenever you have a client server application, something like Apex Legends, where you have game clients, right, that are connecting to some type of centralized server architecture, there's always the possibility for vulnerabilities to exist at the server level that might allow a threat actor to do something like what happened during that tournament, which was they appeared to have been injecting code into game clients to alter, how they're functioning, cheats effectively, look like. So I don't know too much on the specifics. Someone mentioned it was an RCE. I'm not completely surprised by that. It's crazy to see. Companies spend a lot of money on anti-cheat trying to prevent this, and it's funny because anti-cheat has a lot of similarities to endpoint detection and response platforms. When you think about platforms like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne or these other platforms, they are designed to detect behavior on a system that is unwanted, and that unwanted behavior could be malicious software, could be cheats for a game program, because there are some kernel level anti-cheat drivers out there. They're very similar, and the anti-cheat guys who are there, the cheaters themselves, the people making these, some really smart guys who could probably do very well also in the offensive security field, because they're finding ways to bypass, sophisticated telemetry and behavior analysis and all of these things, which is what malware authors and red team, writers do. So yeah, it's pretty funny to me.
There's a raging debate going on over attribution in the chat, which I refuse to take sides on. No one knows who it is. Some people are claiming that they know who it is. Other people are saying TLDR anti-cheat can be used as rootkit. So I think that we'll save the rest of that one for the news stream on Friday. So another question we had come up was something that I was going to talk about actually tomorrow. I'm just going to throw it out there. I don't think we'll talk too much about it, but there's something called GeoBox, which is being advertised for the Raspberry Pi as a evasive fraud tool. So this is interesting to see, like a paid for access, like Raspberry Pi image that allows you to do a bunch of cybercrime apparently. But I haven't had a lot of time to go over this yet. But it kind of ties into what we were talking about like customizing tools and being able to go after like all sorts of targets in interesting ways. Like threat actors are really clever, and especially when these tactics, maybe getting an open source tool that's easy to acquire and has just enough power to do some damage involved, and like making it just completely idiot proof. I've kind of seen, that model with other types of cybercrime software where you have people, becoming ransomware affiliates. If it's possible for anybody with a Raspberry Pi to consider a life of crime through one of these like idiot proof crime boxes, then an interesting development potentially. But I imagine trying to keep this sort of thing from being proliferated would be pretty difficult with a price point that's relatively high. The only thing that would make this really worth it to pay for the upfront thing would be, some sort of subscription and support, which then is also probably vulnerable to things like an exit scheme. So I don't really know too much about this yet. I just wanted to throw it out there as something we're going to be talking about on Friday. But interesting to see that some of these cybercrime concepts, like becoming a ransomware affiliate, might be trickling down to like, okay, you could be a Raspberry Pi crime box affiliate. And I don't know exactly what this is specialized towards. Maybe it's putting it at a local gas station and skimming credit cards or something. Like, who knows? But it is the same model that I've seen in other sorts of cybercrime trickle down operations.
And we've been seeing this kind of thing a lot lately, these, miniature attack tools, whether it's, they're not exactly new, but things like USB, like rubber duckies, things like Flipper Zeros now that everybody's using to potentially steal cars, to, access buildings they shouldn't be able to access, replay attacks with this sort of thing. It's not a, a new concept to have some interesting hardware that does something, but when someone comes along and bundles it in a very easily consumable way, to me, this is no different than like a ransomware as a service, which is super popular. Company, some guy comes along, he sells ransomware as a service, he sells an executable, he sells access to their affiliate program so that you can purchase and use their ransomware. They may even set you up with access, and you are just, or maybe you're purchasing access from a third-party broker or something. But a lot of attacks and threat and criminal groups operate this way, where they are selling some type of attack, something as a service, whether it's GeoBox as a service. I'm not super familiar with that one in particular. Ransomware as a service, all kinds of stuff like this. Access as a service, a lot of examples.
So, all right, I want to get to the incident. Oh, wow, we switched places. That's funny. So I also want to get to the incident of the month, because I think you've got some interesting stories to tell about what attackers are actually doing. And I'm interested to hear exactly like what kinds of attacks are especially effective and what kinds of things are prolific right now. Like if something is just going to work, then it's probably something that multiple different threat actors are going to be doing. So I guess that's my invitation to what's your craziest story you want to share with us this month?
Sure. We could talk. Obviously, there's a lot of stories. We could stay here for a few hours and kind of go through a lot of stuff, and we don't have time for that, I guess. So we'll stick to one for now, and we'll see where that goes. And there's a lot more of context we could add in there. So a recent, didn't happen this month necessarily, so incident of the month might be a bit of a misnomer. But recently enough, we had a case where a client contacted us and said, "Hey, we've been hit by ransomware. We need help investigating this, responding to this, rebuilding our network, restoring our business continuity, etc." There's a lot of things that happen here, but that's kind of the summary. They had ransomware. They called us for help. So okay, we show up, kick off our investigation, which we normally do by capturing, let's call it a triage package from critical places in the environment, domain controllers, devices that were impacted by the ransomware, such as their file servers, any kind of key crown jewel data storage location. That's something we're going to want to triage. We're going to want to get the lay of the land, understand what's going on, and once we have this triage data, we'll take it all back internally, and we have some systems where we'll analyze that data and kind of hunt through it, try to put a timeline of activity together. So one of the first things we did was, looking at where the ransomware, the actual encryption event came from. We identified it was a particular server in their environment that had, done the encryption activity. And this particular server was hosting Citrix-related infrastructure. And for people who aren't familiar with what Citrix is, it's a very common application that is most frequently used to expose applications or virtual desktop environments to users over the internet, or over the network rather. It doesn't have to be over the internet, but a lot of times it's used by companies to expose their remote workforce to applications that they need to work, and to virtual desktop environments, so they can log in via the internet. They go to the portal, they log in, they get a window in the browser or in the desktop, depending on what's installed, and they can work as normal. And then that application can connect to whatever it needs to do internally. In this particular use case, they were using it to publish custom applications to their user base. And the first issue here was there was no MFA attached to this service. So as long as you had the right username and password, you could log in, and that's kind of the first issue here, because if you are exposing something publicly and you don't have MFA attached to it, it's just going to be a matter of time before that leads to a breach. That's my perspective on this.
You're going to be like the third person to find out that your credentials were involved in a data breach, after the owner of the threat actor, the owner of the website, and then finally you.
Absolutely. It's just it's a real problem for a company to have something exposed to the internet. Now, this could be Citrix or any other public-facing application. This could be RDP, unfortunately, for some organizations exposing this over the internet. This could be often VPN. We see a lot of VPN where there's no MFA being applied. Even something as simple as having a certificate on an endpoint to protect that, or doing actual MFA in some other way. Really important to protect those network-facing applications. And I'm going to share something really quick, if that's okay, just one window.
Yeah, of course.
Just to show the real importance of this. If you don't have MFA deployed in your environments for your remote services, and this, what we're looking at here is Azure sign-in logs. And what we see is, a lot of successful logins, by the way, to various Azure applications, Office 365, etc., via Nigerian IP addresses. And a lot of these were for separate users. So this is the type of thing that you don't expect to see if you're a US-based company, right? This is not something you should be seeing.
Is there any way you could zoom in for our friends who might be on mobile devices?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So, this is kind of the stuff that we don't want to see. So if we come into your environment, we're going to take a look at remote access authentication logging, whether it's for your VPN, for your Citrix, for your Azure, for O365, whatever AWS, whatever portals you have. That's something we collect, because we're going to scan that. We have some custom tooling where we can enrich those logs, with effective geolocation, DNS results, DNS lookups, threat intelligence, etc., and really quick get some answers on, well, do we see any suspicious login activity? And this is something we would consider suspicious login activity, certainly.
So to me, hearing about this all the time, that makes me think one of three things might have happened. Somebody had their specific password breached and there was a reuse. So they just logged in once with the correct credentials and there's no incorrect login attempts. They got phished, which means also no incorrect login attempts, or a password spraying attack where there's a bunch of incorrect logins and then suddenly a correct login, maybe because that person had a breach and it was a similar password and maybe only a couple characters were changed, or there was some other sort of password weakness there.
All three of those are valid, and unfortunately something that we often don't have the answer to. So, we can identify usually the initial access vector, but what we normally can't do, or what's much harder to do, let's say, is to identify how they got those credentials in the first place. It could have been a phishing attack from months ago. It could have been a personal account that reused, the same password. It could have been any number of things that happened that allowed the threat actor to obtain this credential. That can be much harder. Now, obviously, if we see a very obvious, phishing email, password spray type attack, or evidence of password spray, that can help us understand, okay, you were the victim of a successful credential, brute force, or a credential stuffing attack, or a phishing email, if we can prove that. More often than not, we can identify how they got in, not necessarily why they got in. That's kind of the key difference.
That's still crazy to me. But yeah, no, it makes sense.
No, it's very interesting. So, following up from this point, so now we have a threat actor. They have access to the customer's Citrix environment, and the customer is exposing a custom application in that environment. And what happened was the threat actor did some kind of scanning of this application, well, before I jump into that, we audited access logs. We determined that this access had been occurring for some time, this malicious access for this user and actually a number of users in the environment. And something, when you see a user logging in from a Roadrunner IP or a Spectrum IP, that's normal. Those are home IPs, these home ISP blocks of addresses, depending on whatever ISP is in your area. This is different all over the country, all over the world. But it's easy to distinguish a home ISP, and then suddenly you see the same user logging in from an AWS EC2 box. That's very different. That's malicious to us, or a data center provider in Germany or the Netherlands. Like when we see logins from data centers, from VPN IP addresses, these are immediate red flags. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, I get to reset my password, at our work every time I forget and leave my own personal VPN on, because it's such a red flag to suddenly see what should be a consumer, like IP blocks suddenly be logging in from a commercial one. Like that's generally, it generally could be a red flag. Yeah.
And it's something we scan for. When we collect this remote access login, we'll have a tool to enrich and automatically tell us, is it a known data center IP? Is it a known VPN IP, known threat intel like OSINT, open source intelligence indicator potentially? So, maybe a known command and control IP, stuff like this, where we will, scan your logs real quick and see, is there any low hanging fruit there? So we saw this in their auditing, obviously. And then the next thing we see is we took, data from the Citrix device. So this was a Windows server hosting the Citrix infrastructure. And we collected triage from the Citrix server to investigate further. And through our analysis, we found evidence that this particular application that the threat actor had access to it appeared that they had exploited a log4shell specifically vulnerability against this custom application, which leads to a next point is any application you're exposing that kind of faces the internet, which in this case was, you should be regularly pen testing. You should be regularly, vulnerability scanning and updating and patching, because if you're not keeping a strong patch cadence, that's kind of one of the biggest reasons we see breaches occur is lack of a strong patching cadence. That's right up there with lack of MFA. These two things together would have stopped a lot of the breaches that we've been involved in. But it's hard, when organizations grow, they have so much infrastructure deployed out there. They're not necessarily keeping a good eye on what the patch levels are and what security settings are enabled. So that was one of the problems with this. And we found evidence that Log4Shell had been exploited months before the ransomware, the actual encryption event. So they were in there for a while, unfortunately.
Wow, that's crazy. So like from what I know about businesses I've worked with, like this sort of arises often when like businesses will need a specific thing to be built for a one-time purpose, and they'll engage with maybe a contractor or somebody else that builds it for them. It gets integrated into their environment, and then unless it breaks, they never touch it again. Because it's working, and like it's not really included in some of the other IT auditing because it's considered like a third party created thing. So updating it involves either like hiring a contractor who might have gone out of business, or like, just like trying to reverse engineer something that someone else did with minimal notes like years ago, which can be a very, very time intensive and not very rewarding experience when the only benefit is mitigating what to them might just be a potential security risk.
Yep. And that's the hard thing. It's a trade-off. Cybersecurity is a business of risk and risk trade-offs and risk acceptance and understanding, well, at what level, at what monetary, level is this risk to me? What's the value of this risk in dollars? How can we portray this? And it can be very difficult to understand what the impact is until it's too late, until someone creative enough to cause it to have an impact has come in and done damage to your environment. So it's always a trade-off. It's always a balance, between security and IT and finance to understand, well, how much effort, how much money do we need to put into keeping these things fully up to date? How strong is our patching cadence? Because you can't just say, well, we'll patch everything as soon as it comes out, because you might have business critical infrastructure, depending on this stuff. So now you have to establish patch cycles, and you have to have some level of risk acceptance along with this. Like, oh, a new CV came out. Is it critical enough to warrant, disrupting the whole business network to patch? And it's a hard question to answer for any org. It was an interesting one. I mean, beyond that, once they exploit this Log4Shell, this allowed them to execute code as the service account running the Citrix application. And this kind of leads into the third major point here. The idea of least privilege. This is a very easy concept. You should not have permissions to access something that you don't need permissions to access. And that's really it. That's what it boils down to. Because in this case, the Citrix infrastructure was being run by a service account that had domain admin. And domain admin, if you're not familiar, is the strongest permission you can have in an Active Directory network in a corporate environment. It will let you do pretty much whatever you want. And having your public-facing infrastructure being run by an account that has domain admin is a very dangerous thing, because all it takes is one vulnerability. And now the threat actor has domain admin. They didn't even need to do privilege escalation. They just had it just from the get-go.
That's crazy. So the entire thing was one set of credentials away from admin access the entire time.
One set of credentials away, and one clever attacker using Log4Shell, which is really easy to abuse, and an unpatched application and no MFA. So all these things, tied together. But realistically, yeah, I mean, if you're running public-facing infrastructure, it needs to be locked down as much as possible. That Citrix account really did not need to be a domain admin to do what its tasks, but it's much easier for IT teams and identity teams to over permission than it is to permission as granularly as needs to be to get the job done. It's a very difficult thing. There's, most organizations who are mature from a cyber perspective will have teams of people just dedicated to doing identity management, because it is that difficult to do correctly and securely.
That's crazy. All right, so we've got some audience questions. So from someone who's getting started learning ethical hacking, and probably going to be learning some of these tools we might be talking about, would you recommend that they add a user account on their computer or keep it on their main account to get started? I mean, I know what my answer would be on that, but what do you think?
I guess it really depends on what you're doing. I mean, and, from a development, if we're talking about, taking some existing open source tools and playing with those types of tools, I probably would recommend running, virtual machine on your computer, and kind of having a virtual machine so that things are isolated away from your main computer. You don't, whenever we're doing this type of work, or, malware analysis work, it's always on a virtual machine in a sandbox in a way that's not connected to anything you even remotely care about. Because something goes wrong, that's a problem. Yeah.
So you got, in my view, you got two options. You've got the virtual machine option, and then you've got the $200 ThinkPad option. You can pick one. If you want to go on, eBay and get a $200 ThinkPad that some business has shed a while ago that's like slightly overspec for the cost, that's great. You got a great computer. And if somebody manages to get root on it and it becomes part of a botnet that's attacking God knows what, then, you can just toss out the hard drive and not feel that bad. But otherwise, I would keep it strictly away. We see a lot of supply chain attacks against open source tools. As security researchers and as hackers, we tend to be in interesting places and have access to interesting things. And a lot of the time, hackers or researchers have been targets because we might have interesting exploits that we're working on that threat actors would be able to benefit from or sell. So because people who are learning ethical hacking, or even just researchers in general, are kind of highly targeted, I would say be very careful about running hacking tools on your personal device, or anything that you log into, anything you care about. I would strictly separate those either via the ThinkPad method or via the virtual machine method. Another question, well, I guess this was more of a statement from James, was some advice saying that he runs Shodan on his home network regularly, and he's found and corrected several issues. And he went on to say that Cloudflare has free tier that also lets you add MFA access to other self-hosted stuff, and that if you are running a Home Assistant server, especially if it's exposed online, you're going to want to turn MFA on for pretty much the exact same reason, but for your own personal network. So both of those good recommendations, and I would say, definitely getting that on Home Assistant would be a good idea.
I mean, the Shodan piece too. It's funny that you say that, because this is something we do in our engagements. One of the first things we'll do is we'll ask the client for, some of their public-facing domains, infrastructure, IP address, networks, things like this, and we'll, take a look and see, well, what's exposed? Is there a RDP exposed on a device that maybe you were unaware of, that maybe led to this potential incident, or whatever activity we're seeing? So, Shodan's a great tool for doing that type of reconnaissance. We use it a lot as well.
Yeah, so there was a time when I was making a null byte video on Shodan, And actually, we were making it on finding weird webcams on Shodan specifically. We made the episode, and then as a goof, I went to my own IP address remotely, and I found out that somehow I had, without knowing what I was doing, set up a webcam of the outside of my house to be publicly exposed on the default port 80 of my own IP address. So anytime I had leaked my own IP address, I was basically giving people a window into my front yard live, where you could see me like coming and going in my car. And like, I was like, that's a little bit more exposure than I anticipated. So I shut that down. But yeah, you really should take your own IP address and look, is anything exposed? Is there anything there? Like sometimes your home improvement projects or your home automation projects involve being exposed, and hopefully if you have anything that is exposed, you need to make sure, of course, that it has MFA because of all the reasons we just stated.
Absolutely. Keep yourself protected. It's a digital world. I mean, everything's connected. Everything you plug in at home is connected. They're trying to make, smart washing machines, smart fridges. Everything's trying to connect to the internet. I don't know if anyone's seen Silicon Valley. Love that scene where Guilfoyle hacks all the fridges around the world. It's fairly amusing and not too far off from what could be reality. So.
Oh, cool. Yeah, and you're welcome for the information. Someone else comments, you don't want to execute a malicious file by accident on your computer. Yeah, if you were doing school projects, if you're doing work projects, if you have important stuff going on, you really want to make sure that anything that you're executing is in an environment where if it were to ransomware it, you would not pay more than $5 to get it back. All right. So that gives us about 10 more minutes. And we were talking ahead of time that there were some other interesting incidents or some other interesting things you have observed. Is there anything else you want to shout out as an interesting perspective you've had as a forensics and incident response person?
Sure, absolutely. If there's something I could summarize briefly, it's that something we kind of alluded to in the beginning of this is threat actors keep it simple. We hear about a lot of very interesting, very unique attack paths or other mechanisms, offensive security mechanisms that we hear about on the news every week, every day. What we see in reality is threat actors, they like to keep things very simple. When they come onto a box, they're going to try to maintain persistence on that device. And the way that we most commonly see this being done is through off-the-shelf IT tools like AnyDesk, like TeamViewer, like Tight or Ultra VNC, GoToAssist, Screen Connect. These are all tools that we see in literally every investigation we run because they're so easy to use, they're so proliferated, and if an IT environment is already using Screen Connect for legitimate purposes, then one more installation is going to fly under the radar. People aren't going to pay attention to it. They're not going to alert to it. EDRs aren't going to block these types of tools. They're not malicious tools. They may give you an alert, if it's super out of the norm, but most of the time they're not even going to alert to it. And it's something that we see all the time. So they might rename the executable sometimes. They might hide it somewhere, but we see this probably 95% of investigations. We see these types of tools being used.
Really? So that list you just gave is, I would say, 25 to 40% of those I've covered in Nullbyte episodes when I was just getting started doing this sort of thing. And I just needed to connect remotely to my Raspberry Pi in order to run Kali on it. And I found that a lot of these things that are maybe the first or second thing you learn when you're trying to set up a Raspberry Pi and connect to it remotely or do some of these other fairly basic tasks, those are actually the same techniques that threat actors will use because they're so simple, they're so universal, they just work. And it also makes attribution extremely difficult because if, me on day 2 of learning how to work with a Raspberry Pi can pull it off, then what's the list of suspects? You're not really ruling anyone out at that point.
No, I mean, and that's beyond that when we're talking about maintaining access to a device, because most often, if a threat actor, let's go back to my Citrix example, let's say they did exploit the server, and let's say that there was a strong firewall or proxy presence, so the server could not communicate to just anything over the internet, which unfortunately, more often than not, there isn't. So threat actors kind of have wide access to the internet from this server. Other techniques that we see, if it's not one of those types of remote access tools or RATs, what we're often going to see is some type of tunnel capability to establish a network tunnel between that compromised server and the attacker infrastructure that can be using tools like ngrok, Cloudflared, it's called, using SSH, just basic reverse SSH tunnels, or some other proxy capability to kind of enable them to act as if they were on the network from their infrastructure directly. So those two things together almost 100% of investigations, we see some form of persistence involving these tools.
Yes, ngrok. Every time I see a server hosted on that, I'm like, something's going on here. There's a connection that shouldn't be here.
I mean, and there are legitimate purposes for it too, but it's one of the first things we scan for in a target environment. If you call us in for help, those are the things we're going to look for because they're just so common that we see them almost every time, and it's just the first thing we look for.
Yeah. I imagine if you're seeing like, yes, this box is connected to an ngrok server running Let's Encrypt, like TLS server. Like, okay, well, you have a self-signed server. We've never seen this before. There's probably some things there that could either be like a really poorly set up connection from a beginner or malicious infrastructure, and it's probably really hard to tell.
I mean, there's that, and then there's other. They really do keep it basic. So we were helping. There was another organization we were assisting once, and we came in the middle of an investigation, and we logged onto a device that we identified, and we logged on directly, interactively, and we identified. We actually had interrupted the attacker's session. They were RDP to the box, and what they had open was they had a command window open. I can show this too.
Yeah, please.
They had a command window open like this. I'm gonna pop this open right here.
Yeah.
So this is from a different presentation where we cover some of this stuff. Yeah, but we logged in and they had a window open, and this is what was on the window. And this was actually moving in real time. And what this represents is they were using a tool called rclone. And rclone, if you're not familiar with it, is basically it's similar to like a mega agent or other things where it's an agent that allows users to easily sync data up or down to different sinks and sources. So in this case, they had set up an SMB server over the web, and they were syncing data from the file share internally up to this SMB share. And you could see in real time. So we knew exactly what they had taken already because we stopped this, and we were able to scroll through and kind of see what files had made it out, and exactly how much had made it out. And this was super interesting too, because rclone in this format actually requires a configuration file with the creds and clear text. So we were able to actually see the target IP with the credentials to access that device. And this is similar with tools like FileZilla, Megasync, WinSCP. And this was a particularly interesting one because attackers, they don't really care. They keep it very simple, like I'm talking about here.
That's crazy. Okay, I also realized I was getting ngrok, which is a distinct tool, and nginx confused in that example I gave. And also people were saying VLC or VNC, and my response is both. As someone pointed out, you can stream the screen from VLC, the cone program. And I would, be like, no, but they wouldn't give me one of those traffic cone hats at the last conference I went to, no matter how nicely I asked those wonderful French people. So used for cybercrime, who knows? No one can confirm or deny. Give me a traffic cone hat, and maybe I'll say that it's impossible. But there's yes, I'm sorry. James already saw me coming on still being bitter about not getting a traffic cone hat. Yes, that is definitely influencing my reporting here. An unrelated question, but a good point. Can I do videos about Mr. Robot like David Babal did? I did a couple, and those are actually some of the most popular videos on this channel. But the problem is I kept getting hit with copyright strikes to the point that we couldn't go live for like a week, and it was making everyone very nervous because every time we published a video, somebody would do a copyright claim on it, and we would have to fight that claim before we could go live. So it was a little bit of a pain. I would like to do it again. I think David Babal is very brave for doing that because the copyright side of making hacker-related content is honestly the worst. If we're doing like a reaction video to a scene, or if we're talking about Mr. Robot, I can't really show any clip for more than a couple seconds or with clear audio. Otherwise, we get hit and the entire channel isn't able to go live. So it was a little bit annoying to do those, but I would like to do it again. I just need to find a way to weasel around all of the frivolous like copyright claims when we try to do like a hackers react section. Because I mean, with everything you've seen, I feel like you would be able to watch one of those scenes and have some pretty interesting commentary on like what is a real hacking technique and what is like purely imaginary.
I like Mr. Robot. I think that's a great show because it is, I think, one of the more down to earth ones. I think there's still some parts that are obviously exaggerated for TV drama, but compared to some other things we've seen, you see things like Enhance on CSI and things like this. And, there's some things that are completely ridiculous. And there's things like Mr. Robot, which are much more realistic, down to earth, and really fun to watch too.
Yeah, and when they're grounded in reality, so it might be exaggerated, but there's still elements of it that are real, and we
Yeah,
can trace back to real hacker culture. I think that's kind of the treat with watching that.
absolutely.
We should make a separate channel for hacker reaction videos. That would be kind of fun, honestly. We have so many friends, and I'm very sarcastic, but we just haven't done it much because I'm tired of the stream not going live. But I wouldn't mind doing that, honestly. And I do have another separate YouTube channel. I can maybe do a couple of those on. I just don't want to get this one taken down. I got nervous. I didn't want to get banned from Security Forward after finally getting it to 50,000 subscribers. So, all right. So I think that we are just about out of time. Oh, look at this question. Is there a way to debug the Windows kernel from Linux? I'm sorry, that is above my pay grade. But hope to answer some more questions later on in the week. Since we're out of time, I'm going to cover more things on Friday, but we're going to be talking about a lot of the news that came out. Facebook/Meta in the news for doing some interesting VPN connection stuff in order to snoop on Snapchat users, and a lot more stuff we're going to be talking about on Friday. So stay tuned for that. And also, thank you for coming on and talking about all the incident forensics and incident response stuff. I don't think that I've heard any stories from someone who's so well placed before. So it was really interesting and refreshing to hear what's actually going on out there, and what kinds of things are actually like leading to successful attacks.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, my pleasure. Really fun to come on and speak to you and speak to everyone here. And hopefully we can do it again soon.
Absolutely. Well, I think that from now on, we're going to have an incident of the month segment. So if everybody agrees, I think that this would be a great way for us to stay connected to what's actually going on out there from the perspective of someone who's dealing with real companies, dealing with real incidents, and talking about what real attackers are doing. So thank you for coming on. And of course, if everybody in the audience wants to support the channel, go ahead and go to varonis.com/Kody. That's Kody, and you can check out our link of the week. It's a way of supporting the stream. It's free, and it lets everyone know that you appreciate what we do and want us to keep going live every week, twice a week. So thank you very much to everybody on the stream. I think we got up to, like 120 people at our peak today. That's awesome. I'm glad we're starting a little later, because I think before we were like peaking at around like 60 or 70. So we're like doing really well. Great to see the growth, and great to see everybody so engaged in the chat. And we will see everybody on Friday for our new stream. So goodbye, everyone.